Um, Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We appreciate your attendance and participation in our events, even during these crazy times. My name is Paul Sherman. I am the not senior programs manager anymore, director of programs for SID Washington. So just wanted to again thank all the speakers for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And your participation and feedback in our events and providing commentary on this really important issue. I also want to give special thanks to our co-chairs, Emily Janik and Lane Pollack, who is unfortunately not able to join us today, as well as our former policy and learning co-chair, Jake Grover, who is the moderator for this event. So thank you for your support. We very much appreciate it. Just I won't go through our typical spiel just because I want to get through the content, and Jake said that we have a tight schedule today, but just want to plug quickly some of the programming that we'll have coming up. We do have some very interesting programs and events coming up over the next few weeks. Some around, obviously, what's been going on with recent events in the United States around race and diversity in international development. We're doing a few events on that subject, so keep your eyes open for those notices. We have one that's next week on race and diversity in tech, so we already have one already on the schedule, but there will be a few more coming up that we have in the works. And that is all I will mention from a programming standpoint. For today's event, as some of you may already know, the only ones who will have their mics turned on will be myself, SID staff, as well as the speakers. We ask that you have your mics turned off just to make it a little bit easier for everybody. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to send them in the chat box. That's the best way to communicate with us. And then if you're on the phone, we'll send out a notice in a second in the chat box that will have some of the important dialing that you'll need in terms of muting your mic and also raising your hand to ask any questions. So with that, I will hand it over to Jake, who will get us started today.
Great, thank you, Paul, and thank you to SID for hosting us and for the support on the call today. Welcome, everyone, to the Policy and Learning Workgroup event, How Decisions Get Made, Leveraging Learning to Influence Policy and Programs. Good afternoon, and happy opening day to all the Nats fans out there. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jake Grover. I'm a senior advisor at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and as Paul pointed out, a former co-chair of the Policy and Learning Working Group. I especially want to thank the current co-chairs, Emily Janik from CARE and Lane Pollack from USAID, for planning the event and for obliging me on the topic today, because this is something that I've wanted to do for a couple of years now. It's a topic that's come up frequently in previous events, as well as our working group planning meeting at the start of this year. And that topic is, what is the best way to present information, data and analytics, and learning to senior policymakers? So in the event description, we posed the question, have you ever wondered if your knowledge product actually got read by leadership? Well, I've had the great privilege of working with two of the three panelists, and I can tell you that their briefing materials are often too long, too technical, or just not what they need. So sorry about that, Nancy. So today we ask, how do senior leaders absorb and use information to make the decisions that shape policy? And what better way to find out than to ask them directly? So that's why we're here today, and we have a fantastic panel for you. But I've already spoke far too much, and I know you're all eager to hear from our panelists. But before getting started, I did want to encourage everyone to use the chat box to pose questions to the panel at any time, and I'll try to work those in as we go. So I want to start by asking the panelists to compare and contrast the decision-making cultures at the various places they have worked. I figured that instead of hearing me read out their bios, this is a good opportunity for each of them to reflect on the decision-making culture at each of the various positions, and then along the way, give you a sense of their career paths. So let me turn first to Sheba. Sheba Crocker is the Vice President for Humanitarian Policy and Practice at CARE, was previously an Assistant Secretary for International Organizations at State, also worked in National Security Council, Gates, the UN, and CSIS. So Sheba, welcome. Thank you for joining the panel on short notice. How would you compare and contrast the places you have worked when it comes to using knowledge and learning to shape policy?
Thanks, Jake, and thanks for having me today. Look forward to a great discussion. And I think, as you noted in my resume, I've been a bit peripatetic in my career, so I think I probably won't try to cover all the different places I worked, but I thought it might be useful just to think about a few of the differences that I found in the cultures from the US government side, particularly the State Department, where I spent the bulk of my career, and now being in an NGO, being at CARE. And I mean, needless to say, the cultures are markedly different, but including the cultures around how decisions are made, and I think what influences decisions. And it's still, I have to say, a bit of a culture shock for me, having spent most of my career either inside the US government or then a decent bulk inside the United Nations, to be in the NGO world, where I think the stakes feel incredibly high for decisions that are made from the perspective of those inside the NGO. But from the perspective of somebody who's come from, mostly from two places where the stakes are markedly higher by order of magnitude, I do notice a kind of a challenge around a decision-making culture in what I've come to describe as a low stakes but highly resource constrained environment. And that is like the NGO world versus, say, the US government or the United Nations. It's far less hierarchical, and the process is far less clear. So on the one hand, I think that opens up an opportunity for all kinds of different inputs into decisions. But it's also not always clear the process through which decisions are made and the points of entry at which your attempt to get any particular information in, whether it's information that you've derived, whether it's information that's coming from the outside, et cetera. It's not always clear what the entry points for that those are. I mean, needless to say, I think inside the US government, at least in normal times, there is a very functional policy-making process, and people at different stages of it, understand very clearly kind of what their role in that is and how they are able to both, siphon and use information that they've gotten from myriad sources and then feed those into a policy-making process. And it doesn't always feel transparent, I think, from the outside, but from the inside, the process is pretty well understood. There also are a lot of kind of, the stakes being higher means, there are also often, I think, more urgent decisions that need to be made, and a very well-defined process around how decisions are made means that there are constantly action-forcing events that just force you into understanding, again, when it is that you need to bring in whatever the piece of information is. I think another thing that I was struck by when I was thinking about this was that both, I mean, in all three of those, I would say the UN, certainly the US government, and certainly the NGO world, there are varying kinds of navel gazing that go on. I am constantly amazed by how often in NGOs we talk about ourselves, either the particular NGO that you are in or just the NGO sector. Obviously, when you're working inside the US government, it's a different kind of navel gazing in the sense that it's a very US centric view. And that, difference really struck me when I went into the United Nations. Just, when you're in the US government, it's like the US is the center of the world. And then you go into the United Nations, and needless to say, we're one of almost 200 member states, and it's just a different, it's a very different feeling. But I think that what that also means is that the kinds of information that are useful for decision makers really differ, both depending on the level that you're talking about, depending on the agency that you're talking about, but also depending on whether you're looking at decision makers inside the NGO world, where you're more likely to be influenced by stuff that is going on in your own NGO, but maybe around the world, versus the kinds of things that might influence you, for example, if you're a policy decision maker inside the US government.
So I'm hearing structure matters, process matters, but also the type of information depends on your audience. Let me turn to Wade next. Wade Warren is the Chief Strategy Officer for International Development at Deloitte. He previously served as the Acting Administrator at USAID and Assistant Administrator for Policy Planning and Learning, among other leaderships at Aid and State. So Wade, how would you compare Deloitte to USAID to State?
I was struck by Sheba's comment that she went through culture shock moving from government to the NGO world, and I had felt the same shock, but maybe for different reasons, moving from government to a big corporation like Deloitte. And the cultures are very different in many ways, and the decision-making processes, I think, is one of the more noticeable ones. I was a little amused by Sheba's comments about the structure around decision making in government, because I think that also varies from agency to agency, and it's truer, I would say, probably at the State Department than it is at USAID. I love USAID. I spent 30 years there, but it's a very much a consensus based decision making culture, and I think sometimes that can lead to suboptimal decisions when you're trying to reach a decision that pleases everybody. You don't always get the best outcomes. But that was sort of the decision-making culture that I grew up in and spent most of my career in. So when I moved to Deloitte, I was very struck by the rigor and the sort of regularized structures around decision-making. So when Deloitte is going to consider something like whether we should pursue a deal or not, or who we want to have be a teaming partner on a project, the ways those decisions made are very regularized. There are regularly scheduled meetings once a week where decisions like that are made. You have to schedule yourself for the next one that's available to you. There are templates to use to provide information to the decision makers that they're going to want to evaluate. People on the call all have very specifically defined roles and things that they're looking at. So the decision-making culture, to me, coming from USAID, feels much more rigorous and more well-defined. So that's, I think, one of the main differences between what I experienced at USAID and what I experienced at Deloitte. But I also, I spent 4 years at the State Department I was on a detail from USAID to state. It was kind of a hardship tour for me. But I felt like at State, the decision-making and hierarchical structures are stronger, or more disciplined than they are at USAID. But I recognize that it all is a matter of degree, because when I was at the State Department, I worked closely with a woman who was on detail to State from the Air Force. And while I thought State seemed more rigorous and disciplined, she thought, compared to the Air Force, that it seemed very, kind of loosey-goosey and not rigorous. So I think there's a range even within the U.S. government of rigor around decision making, and then there certainly, for me, was kind of a quantum difference when I moved to Deloitte.
I guess it depends on what your baseline is, huh?
That's right.
And that's, you mentioned the consensus-based culture at USAID, and that's when I transitioned from USAID to MCC. That was a huge sea change for me, in that people were not willing, were very willing to speak their mind, and were not conflict avoiding at MCC. So let me turn to Nancy. Nancy may have something to say about that as well, because I know Treasury is similar to MCC in that respect. So Nancy Lee is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. Previously, she was the deputy CEO at MCC and has experience at the IDB, and was a deputy assistant secretary for Western Hemisphere and Europe and Eurasia at Treasury. Nancy, now I know everyone knows that MCC has an impeccable decision-making process based on the best data and evidence, or at least they pay me to say that publicly. So how would you compare your experience at MCC to the IDB, to Treasury, and so on?
And thanks, Jake, and thanks, Jake and Paul for organizing this. I think this is an excellent set of questions to deal with, and not often addressed in development. And it gave me a chance to sort of step back and kind of think more conceptually, to compare the different decision-making processes in the three very different organizations I worked with. So a long time at the U.S. Treasury, pretty staid finance ministry, pretty conservative, at least in terms of organizational style. Then I went to the IDB, very Latin-centered organization, an entirely different and much higher level of emotional IQ, I would say, and then came to MCC. So I think you could characterize three different decision-making styles. At least that's what I drew from those three experiences. So in one model is the kind of process and very mission-specific decision-making style, which, as Wade said, you know, it's quite organized in terms of the processes you go through to make a decision. And then there is the leader-driven decision-making process, very much top-down, but it can be inclusive. And then there's the leader-driven decision style that's what I would call opaque. I'm not going to identify which organization is which. So, and they're sort of good at different things. Certainly the MCC process, which is not conflict avoidant, as Jake said, has a very well-established process for coming to decisions on, you know, critical issues like selection of countries and the nature and content of compacts. So there are different levels within the organization of the decision. There's an investment management committee, and then there's a memo that goes to the CEO. And so, and it has certain, I think, very substantial benefits. Those sorts of processes, to me, are good at avoiding big mistakes because there's a lot of touch points on decisions. They're good at mobilizing a lot of information that go into decisions because these various points along the process, beginning with staff level analysis, are an opportunity to bring forward a lot of evidence. They're good at airing a lot of views, especially on controversial issues, and giving people a sense that they have a voice in what comes out of it, and in some cases actually bridge differences. They're a little less good, in my view, on fostering sort of innovation and productivity or creativity. They can be a little slow, and sometimes they're flawed because what happens in those processes is that some parts of the organization are more centers of power than other parts. So there's a bias in favor of some parts of the organization that tend to have a more important voice in the decision-making process. So then the inclusive leader-driven decision is good at creativity, I would say, innovation. And when I say inclusive, I mean at Treasury, at least, when it worked very well, the top of the organization would convene other parts of the organization, get them around a table and have kind of repeated conversations to get to work through issues, and particularly issues that needed rapid decisions, you know, if there are financial crises related issues. So you'd have a lot of people around the table. The people around the table would vary based on expertise and the needs of the particular decision. So you did have a sense that people who were working in the trenches had both a voice in decisions, but also visibility into the thinking of the leader. And that's another thing I would point out is really important. You want the people in the trenches to understand the priorities and the values and the perspectives of leaders who often are having conversations at different levels and know different things than the people in the trenches. So, so I think a leader-driven decision-making process, when it's inclusive, and I think it can be, is one of the best kinds of processes. And then, needless to say, the opaque leadership style, which I have seen, which is a decision gets made at the top, no one really knows why. The meetings that are convened are really for show, to sort of have a discussion and everyone understands that the decision is already made. That is not optimal.
So Nancy, you touched on the issue of leadership, and so took the conversation right in the direction that I wanted to go. And I want to open it up to all three of you in asking what role does leadership play? And specifically, can leadership change a culture? Can they set the tone for more informed decision making? Or when you come in as a leader, you're basically stuck with the processes and systems you have in place, and you got to figure out how to work them? And that's any one of you, but Nancy, you had mentioned it, so maybe start with.
All right, I'll just be really brief. In all three of these models that I was suggesting, leadership matters a lot. I have never seen an organization where the person at the top and the people around the person at the top doesn't have a huge impact on what comes out of that organization, setting the tone for whether, they care about evidence, whether they care about rigor, whether they want an honest assessment of the issues, whether they actually want new ideas, whether they want a level playing field so that people in different parts of the organization can kind of compete for decision-making roles, and whether they're flexible. That the person at the top really sets that tone. One thing that's really important in organizations that do policy in particular is that the organization can be captured by its own orthodoxy and its own sort of theology and its kind of reflexive reaction to things. And you need a leader who can signal in given circumstances that she's open to thinking a new way about something when the problem does not appear to be solvable using the orthodox solution.
I mean, I would just add, because I totally agree with all of that, and I think it makes a huge difference who the leader is. I mean, even in a place like, say, state or DOD, where there may be very long-standing and well-understood kind of hierarchies to drive, business as usual. And those things can and do function even in the absence of and that's the whole idea behind having a career service, right? But also if you think of it from like the military side, there are certain ways in which decisions have to continue to get made kind of regardless, right? Kind of life and death decisions in that case. And, that can exist to varying degrees depending on the organization you're talking about. But I think that's why you also see, when you can start pretty easily to tell when a new leader comes into an agency or an organization, how much they surround themselves with their people and the role that their people play in driving their policy and driving their decision making. So how influential are those people vis-a-vis the kind of rank and file of the building, right, in the case of the State Department? And that differs, like if you think about the Secretary of State, right, like the role that those people around a secretary play really differs from secretary to secretary. And the degree to which there is ownership and good understanding, as Nancy was saying, down in the rank and file about what the policy priorities are of any given secretary and the rest of the leadership of the building, has an enormous impact on kind of the entire process around making decisions and how bought in the rank and file and the rest of the staff and the rest of the building feel to the day-to-day business of the organization. And in times where there's a kind of outsized role for the people who are brought in, that can have really detrimental effects on the morale and other things that are obviously important for the well function of the organization. I really like Nancy's breakdown between kind of the opaque leader-driven versus the more transparent leader-driven. And I think I expect we've all experienced that in different ways, but I think for sure. There is an importance to process that goes beyond just process for process sake, and there is a way to use it to drive a mission forward in a really effective way. And there is a way, and when that isn't happening because it's more of an opaque process or more of a process that's being driven by a small cadre of people around whomever the leader is, because it sends the signal then to the rest of the organization, whatever that organization is, right, that like you're not trusted. that either you're not trusted, or you're not good enough, or you're not smart enough, and you're not valued in how I want to run my operation here. And that can have pretty long-lasting impacts, short-term and long-lasting impacts on kind of how well that organization functions, and just how well it's able to carry out its business, and the happiness, and well-being of the staff within the organization.
So just to chime in briefly, because I agree with Nancy and Sheba, especially on the point of the role of the leader. But first I want to say to that, Nancy, I think your your description of the models of decision-making is just spot on and very smart. I think that was a great way to articulate it. And we've all, I'm sure, suffered under the opaque leadership style model from time to time. But in answer, Jake, I guess to your question, I totally agree that the personality and the desires of the leader make a huge difference in the way an organization makes decisions. But I will say that it can be difficult, I think, for a leader who, for instance, wants to make data-driven decisions if the organization is not adept at generating the kind of data that he or she wants and needs to see. And I have seen examples, in my career, of leaders who wanted to make decisions based on data, and the data just wasn't there, or wasn't available in a form that they could use for decision making. And then that sets up a struggle within the agency, and I think a good struggle, to try to produce the kind of data that the leader wants and needs to make his or her decisions. I can give you, a couple of real world examples. When Condoleezza Rice was Secretary of State, she wanted more visibility into foreign assistance and how it was spent, and exactly where the dollars were going. And the reality at that time is there was no standard definition of what counted as a democracy program, what counted as an environment program, and she created a structure that allowed people to report to her in a standardized way how the money was being spent, and that wouldn't have happened if she hadn't insisted on the data. Another example would be Debbie Burks at PEPFAR, at the HIV/AIDS program. She has insisted on making decisions based on data, and that was a struggle for state and USAID and CDC in the beginning, to give her the kind of data that she needed to make the decisions that she wanted to make. And in fact, I think, sometimes a leader ends up making decisions in the early days on incomplete data, or data that is erroneous, and then the staff sees that, oh, they really are making decisions based on the data we're giving them. We've got to make sure the data is right, and that leads to an organizational improvement in the quality of the data that wouldn't have happened if the leader didn't signal that they were going to make decisions based on it. So 100% agree that the leader makes a difference, but the agency sometimes has to struggle to respond to provide the kind of data that the leader wants.
And I think that sometimes that's a long process. When I came into USAID in 2011, it was at the start of some of the reforms around USAID Forward, and a focus on more data and analysis, and a focus on evaluation. And I heard the metaphor repeatedly. It's a large ship that takes a long time to steer, and you kind of wonder if that's actually the case, or that's just something that's nice to say. But 4 years later, when I was leaving, I saw personally a massive change in terms of, especially in the use of evaluations and rigor. Still a ways to go, but vastly improved, have an M&E policy in place, greater use of data and analytics in CDCSs, et cetera. There was a lot of progress on that front. So we've already talked about culture and leadership. I wanted to dig in deeper on process and systems, because a lot of folks in the group are very focused on KM and operational learning. And sorry for the background noise as the ambulance goes by. Nancy mentioned some of the processes at MCC, including the Investment Management Committee, the selection process that is ultimately decided by our board of directors. she used that as an example of a process working well, although perhaps sometimes slow. But what are good examples that you all have seen in terms of effective knowledge management systems or processes feeding up learning into high-level decision-making? And maybe a related but separate question is, how are you pulling in information from the outside? Shiva mentioned that sometimes NGOs can get very focused. We talked about navel gazing. MCC is guilty of having our MCC blinders on. So how do you make sure you're not just overly focused inwardly and pulling in outside information as well? Maybe Nancy was, or sorry, whoever wants to start.
Sorry, I can jump in maybe with just a little bit of insight from, you know, the State Department side on that, on the sort of latter part of your question. Because I think, you know, like my shorthand, like very flip answer when people ask me, like, how much, you know, when you were an assistant secretary, how much did you rely on like outside reports, you know, think tank reports, NGO reports, whatever? And my answer is 0%, because actually you have no time, literally just no time to absorb or read any of that. If I'm being a bit more nuanced about my answer, it's, you know, to some degree would be a bit hard to put your finger on as the person sitting in that position, because presumably those reports and products and documents, et cetera, are feeding in along the way as stuff is filtered up to you. And so even though you yourself might not have time to absorb it directly, you know, you assume that through osmosis, and obviously you're generally aware of stuff and trying to read where you can, but like if somebody comes in, you know, from a think tank to say, hey, we've just done this great report on this, and you have this wonderful meeting, and they hand you a report and you say, thank you very much, and you like promptly put that report on your shelf and you literally never look at it, right? So that's kind of just the day-to-day reality. But part of the way that the State Department has historically tried to protect itself against that, because, you know, decisions tend to be driven by what are the bilateral relationships at issue. I mean, that's the main thing that drives decision-making in the State Department. You know, and then obviously what do other agencies think and how you're fitting into an interagency process, whatever. But in terms of like the bias, the heavy that state brings to any conversation around a foreign policy or national security issue, it's around the bilateral relationship issue. But there is a whole bureau within the State Department in which I also worked, the policy planning staff of the secretary, that is, you know, sometimes shorthand referred to as the internal think tank of the State Department, but where the idea is that you're not overcome on a daily basis by like the tyranny of the inbox, and you have some time to sit back and both engage with a broader policy and academic world that is outside of the State Department, and think with a bit of a longer term trajectory. So you're not only thinking on the basis of like, what's this particular, you know, bilateral relationship, or like what resolution are we trying to get passed in the UN Security Council, or whatever the thing is, that you have a little bit of a longer time horizon. The reality is that the State Department, like, you know, being very blunt, sucks at that kind of thing. And so like the idea that it has an ability to think and absorb strategic thinking is a little bit like, it's not really happening in the way that you wish that it were, just because of the tyranny of the inbox. Like there's just too much all the time, and it's really hard to take yourself out of that. But there is this protected space for, you know, and you know, the people who work in that office have very direct access to the secretary in particular. They are part of the secretary's staff, and the ability to put papers in front of the secretary that either take a contrary view to stuff that may be being developed by the building, or just an alternative view, not always contrary alternative, or just to take a longer term time horizon, and certainly to try to ensure that the secretary and the senior leadership of the building are informed about big debates around policy that may be happening in the think tank world and in the academic world.
Can I chime in just to quickly say that I completely sympathize with Shiva. I was the head of the Policy Planning and Learning Bureau at USAID, which is, you know, the analog to the the policy office at State. And, you know, I used to feel so guilty. Someone would come in and, you know, they give me their 150-page report on, you know, whatever topic that they had written on. And I always felt like I should read it, but you know, you don't have time. And so I think she was right that if you're a senior decision maker, you have to depend on staff to be current and to, especially in a policy bureau to take the time to read and think what the outside folks are thinking. So I completely agree with you on those comments. I was gonna, Jake, address your question about internal knowledge management and, you know, what are good knowledge management systems and do they work? And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, you know, there's this holy grail that everybody wishes that they had, where you just sit in front of your computer and click a few keys and all the information in your agency about any given topic, you know, appears before you. And I just don't think that you know, such a thing exists. And there have been lots of efforts over time to create dashboards that pull all of an agency's information together in a way that a senior leader can digest it. And I don't think we're there yet. At USAID, there's a thing called the Development Experience Clearinghouse, the DEC, and all projects submit their midterm and final evaluations to this database. So it's like this treasure trove of 55 years worth of evaluations of projects, but its comprehensiveness is also its downfall, because who's got time to search through 55 years worth of project evaluations to find, you know, the nuggets of information that they need. So I think artificial intelligence and machine learning, which we're just at the cusp of understanding what they can do, will allow us to mine those kinds of sources of information for digestible decision-making data, but we're not there yet. I have been impressed at Deloitte. There's a database of all the employees, and when you get hired, you're required to fill it out with your, you know, your language skills and your educational background and your expertise, and then it's searchable by anyone in the firm, so that if you're looking for a French-speaking microfinance you know, development person with expertise in Sierra Leone, you can find that person if they exist. So there are, I think some organizations do better than others at kind of categorizing and managing their data, but we're still a long way to go in those systems, in my view.
I mean, I think Wade, just you put your finger on, for me, why I didn't feel like I could answer the first part of Jake's question. And it's because I don't think, notwithstanding that I've worked in a number of different organizations of different types, I actually don't think I've ever worked in an organization that has a good knowledge management system. So I would be very hard pressed to describe sort of what it feels like or how you then make use of that, because I just don't think I've experienced it, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
So for those of us toiling away trying to establish KM systems, at least we have, we're in good company. Nancy, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to this, particularly picking up on Wade's comment about having a huge evaluation catalog, but not having actionable learnings from it. And I wanted to give a shout out to my colleague, who many of you know, Casey Dunning, who has taken forward efforts on two products. Something called the STAR report, which is cataloging the entire life cycle of our compacts, and then another product called evaluation briefs, which are distilling down these 150-page reports that Wade mentioned down to 3 or 4 pages that are actually usable for senior leaders. But I believe both of those initiatives were spearheaded under Nancy's leadership and then only came to fruition in the last few years. But Nancy, I wanted to hear your response on what you've seen work well in terms of internal processes.
Thanks, Jake. And I'm sure those who took it forward are the ones who deserve all the credit. But just let me make 2 points. One, there's a very simple thing that wasn't done in either of the development programmatic organizations that I was involved in, which is for every project or compact, to have a section in the analysis in the project document, whatever you call it, of relevant past evidence. In other words, whatever you're proposing to do, there should be, the people producing the project document should be responsible for going to whoever in the organization or to whatever documents in the organization are relevant and summarizing what the previous evidence showed, so that you don't leave it up to decision makers at higher levels to start asking questions and trying to assemble people. And oddly, that doesn't generally happen. And then the second thing is, to me, every project document should have a knowledge management section in it that says, here's what we're going to do in the project, but here's what we're going to invest in specifically to gain knowledge on these sorts of issues from this project. And we're going to put resources against it so that it can be done. So very consciously summarizing previous evidence and then developing a way to generate new evidence that you think will be derived from the project. But then I just wanted to say something that's a little bit more relevant to policy organizations, which is one of the most useful things you could do for anyone's career early in their career is teach them how to brief senior officials, either orally or in written form on any sort of decision. Any kind of decision, particularly urgent decisions. And it's really not done. I remember when I started at Treasury, I wrote a memo. I was working on trade policy at the time. I wrote a memo, which I thought was a brilliant memo, with on some decision. And I remember my boss read it, stopped in the middle and looked at me and said, "Nancy, do you actually want people to read this memo?" which was very disheartening, but it made the point, which was it had clearly been framed in a way that no one, not just the length of it, but no one would actually want to plow through this memo. People often start at the end. They give their view of what should be done, and no decision maker wants to be told the end point at the very beginning, or they start in the middle, and then decision making feels like they don't have prior information or a rationale. And so you have to be really disciplined about framing the sort of key issues that the decision maker really has to focus on, and then offering relevant evidence or analysis to those key decisions. So, I mean, that to me is everybody entering an organization where there's an important decision-making process ought to be taught how to brief senior officials, and it would be useful if senior officials participated in that instruction.
I completely agree with that, Jake. And I think, and your very last comment, I think, Nancy, is very relevant. The senior leader needs to tell people what he or she wants to see in a decision memo or a decision process. And then I'm a great believer in templates. If you know what the leader wants and expects to see, then make sure people understand that and that their products adhere to it. But you're absolutely right. People get thrown into positions where they have to brief a senior leader in writing or in person, and they're not given any guidance in general about senior leaders or specifically about the person they're going to be briefing. So I completely agree with that.
So you guys have led right to the next question on, I wanted to ask about KM products. Nancy shared an example from her past of one that didn't work out so well. I think most of us have been there. I was going to ask, what are some of the best knowledge products that you've seen, and what are some of the common characteristics? But if any of you would like to share the flip of that, which is what are some of the worst, remind you it's being recorded, but don't need to name names. If you have any funny stories of things that just didn't work out, either as you planned or someone didn't provide you the information you need, I'd love to hear those stories as well.
Well, so the culture at Deloitte, which I have found amusing, and I guess I'm getting used to it, is everything is in PowerPoint. And so they rely, which I think, has its pluses and its minuses. But one thing that I think it does do for an organization is it requires for people to think about graphics and the presentation of data and how to convey complex ideas in ways other than just through prose. And so we've all seen really good diagrams or schematics that make an idea much clearer more quickly than ever could have been the case, in written prose. And then conversely, very bad graphs or gratuitous icons and emojis, I call them, that just scattered around the slide to give it visual pizzazz, but they don't really add anything. So, but I do think a well-constructed graphic or schematic can greatly enhance a knowledge product and make it easier for people to understand the information if it's well done.
Sheba or Nancy, you want to jump in with an example, either good or bad?
Well, I mean, so I'm struck. I think we are often, many of us in different industries seem to be headed toward this, like, where's the slide deck mentality, as opposed to, what I grew up with in my career, which was very much more like sort of the decision memo format. And I think in part, obviously, it depends on, again, who's making the decisions and how best their brain works, and how best they absorb information and what kinds of information they need. I think it's harder to, if you're thinking about sort of making a policy decision on which there may be a range of options, I tend to think it's a bit harder to construct that effectively in a PowerPoint than with prose. But I haven't seen it, but personally, but you may be able to do that. I think I was, and I've been consistently struck, I have to say, throughout my career at just how much of a vanishing skill the ability to write well is. And it's one of the things that I tell people all the time when I'm sort of asked to give career advice or other things, just that, like, that skill is so incredibly important. I think particularly to get back to the point that Nancy was making about sort of like, how do you brief superiors, and the ability to write succinctly and well and, compellingly is a serious skill. It's not one that enough people have, but it's one that I think can only stand you in good stead throughout your career. One of the things that I thought of when you were asking your question, Jake, I was recalling an effort that we did, and I wouldn't be able to say what the issue was around, but it was an effort at the State Department to do some learning about something that had not gone particularly well. And state is historically not that great at kind of, it doesn't have as great a practice of learning as, say, the Department of Defense does, where, again, I think, because the stakes feel much higher in terms of being life and death sometimes on decisions that they're making, in the U.S. military, rather, not really the Department of Defense, but in the U.S. military, there's like an extreme culture of learning. But we were trying it for this thing that had sort of gone awry. And one of the things that we learned that I think has been sort of instructive to me as I think about this going forward is that you have to have a culture within the organization that doesn't punish people for talking about things that didn't go well. And if it is your experience that your career is going to be it seems like an obvious point, but is going to be hampered in some way because you took part in or admitted that something failed or didn't go well, I think that organization is never going to be, whatever the process or whatever the type of document, right, that organization is not going to be successful at learning from mistakes. And it's very hard to create that kind of culture, I think, particularly in organizations like the State Department, where there is such a long-standing culture of how decisions around promotions and career advancement are made. And I think that, you know, you're going to be much more effective at creating that kind of learning culture within an organization if you feel like you really can give people a safe space. That it doesn't have to be anonymous, that people can feel safe in speaking up about their experiences, even when they weren't that great, or even when something actually might have resulted in you know, what could be categorized as a failure.
Let me just jump in and completely agree with what Sheba just said, because knowledge should not only be collected at the end of a process, it needs to be part of the implementation process. And you need to have learning feedbacks all through the process. And really, I think anybody who's been involved in development projects and investments knows that most of the time almost, something has to be adjusted in a big way in order to make the thing work. And I remember there was one MCC compact we were doing in Georgia, and the original, it was an irrigation, pretty large scale irrigation project, if I remember correctly. I'm gonna make sure I got, yeah, I think it was Georgia. Or it may have been Moldova, sorry.
Moldova water and Georgia was education.
Yeah, that's. So in Moldova, the original idea was to kind of recreate the Soviet irrigation system, which was had fallen into disrepair. And then at some point during the project, it became clear that that would be a really futile thing to do, that the whole thing had to be totally designed and decentralized and given decentralized authority to run the irrigation system with local communities managing decisions. So the whole thing was completely redesigned, and that was a direct function of a knowledge flow from on the ground back to Washington. And I saw that in a number of cases, pre-compact approval and post-compact approval in MCC. I think that's one of the huge strengths of MCC, that there is that knowledge flow. But it takes a lot of oversight. And it takes oversight, not just at junior level. It has to sort of percolate up that, you know, we're in serious trouble here. We have to do a major course correction. And then as Sheba was saying, it takes people saying, okay, we made a mistake, and now we're gonna shift course. So that's really important. On a specific example of a knowledge product that I found very useful, and Jake, you're gonna have to help me out here. There were MCC products where people gathered together all of the impact evaluation evidence for a given sector. And I've forgotten what they were called. But one was done for agriculture, one was being done for transport when I was leaving. So it was an explicit effort to sort of make it easy on people, bring together a whole bunch of whatever evidence was available, be very rigorous about what we found, what we didn't know, and then use that as a repository of knowledge for future. And that's the kind of thing you have to do. And they weren't, 100 pages, maybe they were 15, 20 pages. And I think that those were very useful products.
Yep, so those are principles into practice.
Yes.
And you can find them. And even though they're only 15 or 20 pages, they take just as long as to produce. So I believe the Rhodes one just came out not too long ago.
Jay, can I tell you an amusing anecdote about failure and how whether cultures embrace
Please.
Or not? So when Raj Shah first became administrator of USAID, he had come from the Gates Foundation, which has a very open culture around failure, and they are willingly they do experimental things, and they know that many of them are going to fail, and then they willingly sort of examine them and try to learn from them. So Raj was going to bring that culture to USAID, and as Shiva was saying, when there's a culture around your promotions and your success, and the agency depends on being successful, the whole idea of sort of celebrating your failures was startling to folks. And he actually, Raj wanted to organize a public event that he was going to call a failure summit. And everybody would come forward and, you know, talk about all the things that they had done in their careers that had failed. And I guess needless to say that there was an example where the leader's idea was not successful in changing the culture of the agency, and we never did have a failure summit. But I think she was right. If you're going to learn from your mistakes, and development agencies make mistakes, there has to be some openness to looking at what went wrong, though perhaps not in a public summit.
Yeah, and this is actually something we've done in a previous event. We termed it the results paradox, right? And in order to make an adaptation, you need to first admit that there's a problem. And if you admit there's a problem, then you're not producing results. But if you don't admit to these things, you're not being very transparent about how things are going either. So there's this difficult trade-off that organizations need to deal with of how honest are we going to be with ourselves and external stakeholders. And I think a lot of that boils down to the culture. But I know we're just about out of time, and I want to thank you all for this great conversation. So let me conclude by thanking the panelists. It's been a great conversation. I think I've gained a much better understanding of how senior leaders process information. Hopefully everyone that joined us is able to walk away with some tangible ideas of how to develop more timely and usable knowledge products and make a difference in applying knowledge and learning at your organizations. But I was going to turn it over to the co-chair for the Policy and Learning Group, Emily Januk, who's going to say a few words before Paul closes us out. So over to you, Emily.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jake, and thank you to all of our presenters for this really rich and thoughtful feedback. So as Jake says, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Policy and Planning Working Group, along with Lane Pollock, who wasn't able to join us today. And we do several of these events a year. And some of them are panels like this, where we get a fantastic set of decision makers in and are able to really learn from their experience. And some of them are events where we do things like peer assist, or we might take what we learned from this and start walking through what did we think and how can that change the way we're doing our own work. So we're trying to make sure that they stay connected and it's not just a series of one-off events, but that we're really taking what we learn and apply it, exactly like the conversation today. So a couple of ways for you to stay in touch and to influence this. We really want to be responsive to what members need. So you can certainly email me at any time. I'll drop my email into the chat. And you can also reach out on LinkedIn. I'm there as well. And we will continue regularly to post things both through the SID newsletter and also on the SID website as new events come up. But if you have ideas or something you'd be excited to work on, let us know and we can think about how to make that happen. And also special shout out to everybody who came to our January meeting, which feels like a very long time ago now, where we first had the idea for how are we going to do this event and how are we going to pull this off. So to everyone who contributed to that conversation, we heard you. We have a list of the ideas that came up in that meeting, and we will keep working on those moving forward. So stay tuned for more info. Paul, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Emily. And again, thank you for your work on this event, as well as Lane, and also our wonderful speakers today. We really do appreciate it. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to mention that we have a survey, and I just dropped it into the chat box. I'll put it in there again just for your awareness in case you missed, in case you didn't see it before, to put it back at the top. We really do appreciate your feedback as we continue to develop events and as we continue this journey and doing virtual, obviously entirely virtual programming. So we really would appreciate your feedback as we move forward. And with that, I'll wrap it up and leave it at that. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Hope you stay safe and cool. I know it's really insanely hot here in DC, at least by my Seattle standards. We appreciate it, and we hope to see you again at a future event. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks, Wade. Thanks, Jake. Thanks, Nancy.
Bye.
Thanks.